My sister had a key to my apartment for years and came in whenever she wanted. One day she showed up with her kids and bags, sure they would stay for days. But the door didn't open. The first time I realized my apartment did not really belong to me anymore was on a quiet Tuesday night when I opened my refrigerator and found it completely empty. Not empty because I forgot groceries. Empty because someone else had been there. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the top shelf where my leftovers should have been. The container with half a roasted chicken was gone. The orange juice I bought the day before had disappeared. Even the cheap microwave pasta I kept for late nights was missing. And deep down, I already knew who had taken it. My sister, Rachel. She had a key. She had always had a key. When I first moved into that apartment 3 years earlier, giving her one felt normal. Families shared spare keys. It was just a safety thing. In case something happened. In case I locked myself out. In case of emergencies. At least that was the story I told myself when I handed it to her. But over time, emergencies started meaning something very different. At first it was small things. Rachel would stop by to borrow something. A phone charger. A screwdriver. Sometimes she just needed to print something and said my place was closer than the library. Then the visits started happening when I was not even home. I would come back from work and notice little details. A chair slightly out of place. The faint smell of someone else's shampoo in the bathroom. Once I found tiny socks drying on the radiator. Her kids had been there. Rachel had 3 of them. Good kids, honestly. Loud, messy, curious about everything. But they were not supposed to be spending their afternoons in my apartment. The strange thing was that Rachel rarely told me beforehand. Instead, she would send a message later. Something casual. Something like, "Hey, we stopped by earlier. Hope that is okay." As if the answer had already been decided. For a long time, I convinced myself it was not a big deal. Family helps family. That is what people say. And Rachel had always believed that rule applied especially to me. She was 2 years older than I was, and growing up she had always been the louder one. The one who argued harder, talked faster, and somehow managed to get what she wanted more often than not. As adults, that habit never really changed. It started with small loans. A few $100s here and there when something went wrong. Then a little more. Then a little more again. And somehow, over the years, helping her stopped feeling like something I chose to do. It slowly became something she expected. But the moment I stood there in my own kitchen, staring at that empty refrigerator, a quiet thought crossed my mind that I could not ignore anymore. Somewhere along the way, my apartment had stopped feeling like my home. And the worst part was that Rachel had not even noticed the difference. Rachel had always treated my help like something permanent, like a service that would always be available no matter what was happening in my life. Looking back now, I can see how slowly it happened. Nothing dramatic. No single moment where everything changed. Just a long line of small assumptions. The first time she asked to borrow money, it sounded temporary. Her car needed repairs, and she told me she would pay me back the next month. She sounded embarrassed when she asked. I remember that clearly. Her voice was softer than usual, like she actually felt bad about it. So I helped. $300. Nothing huge. She did pay it back, eventually. That was the beginning. After that, the requests came more often, and each one sounded a little less apologetic than the last. Rent 1 month. School supplies for the kids another month. Then groceries, utilities, and once even a last-minute daycare bill she said she could not cover. Each time, she explained it the same way. Things are just tight right now. And each time she added the same promise. I will get it back to you soon. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she did not. But the strange part was that the money itself was never what bothered me the most. It was how naturally she started assuming I would say yes. There was one moment that stuck with me more than the others. About a year ago, Rachel showed up at my apartment late on a Sunday evening with her kids in the car. I had not heard from her all week, so I assumed something serious had happened. When I opened the door, she barely looked stressed. She just explained that her babysitter had canceled and she needed to run errands. Then she asked if the kids could stay with me for a few hours. Not really asked, actually. It sounded more like a plan she had already decided on. The kids were already climbing out of the car before I even finished answering. 3 hours turned into 5. By the time she came back, the kids were asleep on my couch, crumbs everywhere, cartoons still playing on the television. Rachel walked in, thanked me quickly, and gathered them up like it was the most normal thing in the world. I told myself it was fine. Family helps family. That phrase had become automatic in my head. But after she left that night, I remember standing in the middle of my living room looking around at the mess. Juice boxes on the coffee table, crushed crackers on the carpet, toy cars scattered across the floor. And for the first time, a quiet thought slipped into my mind. Rachel did not see my help as help anymore. To her, it was simply part of the system, something that was always going to be there, something she did not need to ask for. And the worst part was that, up until then, I had been letting it happen. For a long time, I kept telling myself that nothing was really wrong. Sure, Rachel came by more often than she should have. Sure, the kids treated my apartment like it was their second living room. But none of it felt serious enough to start a fight over. At least that is what I believed. But small things began piling up in ways I could not ignore anymore. I started noticing how little control I actually had over my own space. Sometimes I would come home from work and find the television already on. Not paused, not muted, just running cartoons like someone had stepped out of the room for a minute. Other times I would find dishes in the sink that were not mine. Plastic cups, sticky plates, half-eaten snacks left on the counter. The strange thing was that Rachel never acted like she was doing anything unusual. If I mentioned it, she would just laugh and say something light, like the kids must have gotten hungry. Then she would move on to another topic before the conversation could go any deeper. That was her style. Turn everything into something small, something harmless, something not worth discussing. But the moment that really stuck with me happened a few months ago. I came home late from work that night. I had stayed late at the office finishing a project, and all I wanted was a quiet evening. The kind of evening where you sit on the couch, eat something simple, and enjoy the silence. Instead, when I opened the door, the first thing I heard was shouting. Not angry shouting, kid shouting. The kind that fills an entire room and echoes off every wall. Rachel's two youngest were racing down the hallway like my apartment had turned into a playground. One of them nearly ran straight into me before stopping short. From the kitchen, Rachel called out something casual like she had not even realized I had just walked in. She was standing at my stove, stirring something in a pan. For a moment, I just stood there, in my own doorway, watching someone else cook dinner in my kitchen. Her laptop was open on the table. Backpacks were piled on the floor. A cartoon was blasting from the television. Nobody looked surprised to see me. Rachel glanced over her shoulder, smiled, and asked if I could grab milk later because they had used the last of it. That was it. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Because standing there, listening to the noise and looking at the chaos around me, I felt something I had never felt in my own apartment before. I felt like I was interrupting someone else's evening. Like I had walked into a place that no longer belonged entirely to me. And that thought stayed with me long after Rachel and the kids left that night. It followed me for days. Because once you notice something like that, it becomes impossible to ignore. And slowly, I started asking myself a question that made me uncomfortable. When exactly had my home stopped feeling like my home? Once that thought got into my head, I started noticing things I had ignored for years. The biggest one was the key. Rachel still had it. At first, that had felt harmless. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. She could come and go whenever she wanted. And the truth was, she often did. There were days when I would come home and see signs that someone had been there hours earlier. A wet towel hanging in the bathroom. A cereal box left open on the counter. The faint smell of something cooked in the kitchen. Rachel never tried to hide it. Sometimes she would send a quick message afterward. Stopped by earlier. Or, kids needed a place to hang out for a bit. That was it. No question. No warning. Just information. Like I was being updated about something that had already been decided. I began thinking back to when it really started. The truth is, Rachel had always been comfortable using other people's time and space. Even when we were younger, she had a way of turning someone else's help into something permanent. If a friend helped her once, she assumed they would help again. If our parents said yes to something, it quickly became the new normal. And somehow, without either of us really saying it out loud, I had become the easiest solution to many of her problems. Need a place to study? My apartment. Need someone to watch the kids for an hour? My apartment. Need a quiet space for a phone call or meeting? Again, my apartment. For a long time, I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled down in her life, it would stop. But it never did. Instead, the visits slowly became longer. The kids started leaving toys behind. Rachel began keeping spare clothes in my laundry room, so she would not have to bring bags every time. I remember finding a small stack of her folded shirts on top of my dryer one evening. I stood there looking at them for a long moment. wondering when exactly that had happened. She had never asked if she could store things there. She had just done it. That realization bothered me more than I expected. Not because of the shirts themselves, but because it meant Rachel saw my apartment as something she could expand into whenever it made her life easier. And the strange part was that she seemed completely comfortable with that idea. Meanwhile, I started feeling less comfortable every day. I began coming home later from work, sometimes stopping for coffee or taking longer walks before going inside. Not because I did not like my apartment, but because I was never completely sure what I would walk into. The quiet routine I had built for myself was slowly disappearing, and Rachel did not even seem to realize it. But a quiet decision had already started forming in my mind. I just had not told anyone yet, especially Rachel, because if she had known what I was planning, she probably would have laughed. After all, in her mind, nothing about our arrangement was going to change. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, the way uncomfortable truths usually do. At first, it was just a feeling that followed me around during the evenings. I would sit on my couch after work, staring at the walls of my own apartment, and something about the place felt different. Not broken, just unsettled. I started paying attention to how often Rachel came by. Once I noticed it, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Sometimes it was twice a week, sometimes 3 times. Occasionally, she would show up 2 days in a row without warning. The strange part was that she no longer knocked. She would just unlock the door and walk in like she belonged there. One afternoon, I came home early and found her youngest building a tower out of my books on the living room floor. Rachel was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She looked up, smiled, and said something casual about needing a quiet place for the kids to spend the afternoon. Then she asked if I had any snacks. That was when I started noticing something else. Rachel did not seem to think she was asking for anything anymore. In her mind, the arrangement had already been settled. My apartment had quietly become part of her routine, and I had never officially agreed to that. But I had also never stopped it. That thought stayed with me for days. Eventually, it led to another realization that made me uncomfortable. I had spent years building a life that was calm and predictable. After growing up in a house that was always loud and full of arguments, that quiet routine meant a lot to me. My apartment was the one place where I controlled the pace of my life. Or at least it used to be. Now I was adjusting my evenings around the possibility that Rachel might be there. I kept wondering how things had reached this point without either of us having a real conversation about it. The answer, when it finally came to me, was simple. Rachel had never needed that conversation. As long as I stayed quiet, the situation worked perfectly for her. That was the moment when the quiet decision in my mind finally became something solid. I was not angry. I was not planning some dramatic confrontation. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something had to change. Because if it did not, my apartment would never truly belong to me again. Rachel just did not know yet that the version of my life she had been relying on for years was about to disappear. And very soon, she was going to discover that for herself. Once that decision settled in my mind, something strange happened. Nothing around me changed right away. Rachel still came by. The kids still ran through the hallway. Toys still appeared in corners of the apartment, like little reminders that the space was no longer fully mine. But the way I looked at everything started to shift. Before, I had always reacted in the moment. If Rachel asked for something, I would think about whether I could help right then. Now I started stepping back, watching, paying attention to how naturally she assumed everything would continue exactly the same way. One evening she called while I was driving home from work. Her tone was casual, almost distracted, like she was calling about something minor. She said she might stop by later because the kids had a school project and needed a quiet place to work. She did not ask if that would be okay. She just mentioned it. Then she started talking about something else before I could even respond. I remember holding the phone and thinking how automatic it had all become. In Rachel's mind, my apartment was simply one of the tools she used to keep her life running smoothly. It was the quiet place when her house felt too chaotic. The backup babysitter when plans fell through. The spare room when she needed space to think. And somehow, I had slowly turned into the person who made all of that possible. Not because she forced me, but because I had never drawn a line. The truth is, setting boundaries had never been easy for me. Growing up, conflict in our house always escalated fast. Arguments turned into shouting matches, and shouting usually turned into days of tension. So I learned early that keeping the peace was easier than pushing back. Rachel had always been the opposite. She pushed forward. She assumed things would work out in her favor. And most of the time, they did. But over the next few days, something new began happening. Instead of reacting when she called or showed up, I started quietly making changes. Small ones at first. I reorganized the kitchen, packed away the extra blankets Rachel kept using, cleared out the laundry shelf where her spare clothes had been sitting for months. None of it was dramatic. No announcements. No confrontation. Just a quiet reset of my own space. The biggest step came a few days later. I stood in my hallway holding the spare key Rachel had been using for years. For a long time, I simply looked at it. Part of me knew that once I acted, there would be no going back. Because Rachel had built her routine around the assumption that my door would always open. But the truth was, I had already reached the point where that door needed to close. And while Rachel had no idea yet, she had already made plans that depended on it staying open. Plans she never bothered to discuss with me. Plans that would bring her straight to my apartment in just a few days. Only this time, when she arrived, she was going to discover that something she had always taken for granted was suddenly gone. The week before everything finally came to a head was strangely quiet. Rachel did not stop by as often, and for a few days my apartment felt the way it used to feel. Calm. Predictable. The kind of quiet that lets you hear the hum of the refrigerator and the soft traffic outside the windows. I remember thinking how different the place felt when no one else was using it. I could leave a book on the table and know it would still be there later. I could cook dinner without worrying someone would walk in halfway through and ask what I was making. It reminded me why I had worked so hard to build that life in the first place. Growing up, our house had always been loud. Rachel argued with our parents constantly. Doors slammed. Voices carried through the hallways late at night. Even when nothing dramatic was happening, there was always tension in the air. When I moved out on my own, the silence of my first apartment felt almost unreal. For the first time, I had control over my own space. No unexpected arguments. No chaos spilling into every room. Just quiet. That was the feeling I had been trying to protect all these years. And now I realized how much of it had slowly disappeared. A few days later, Rachel called again. Her voice sounded upbeat, almost relieved, like she had finally solved a problem that had been bothering her. She started explaining something about needing to take care of a few things out of town. Work issues. Some paperwork she had been putting off. She talked quickly, jumping from one detail to another. Then she casually mentioned that she would probably leave the kids at my apartment for a few days. The way she said it made it sound like a perfectly normal arrangement. Not a request. A plan. In her mind, the problem had already been solved. She explained that it would only be for 3 days. Maybe 4 at most. The kids already liked staying at my place, she said. They would bring their backpacks and school stuff. It would not be a big deal. I listened quietly while she talked. Rachel never paused to ask if I was actually available. She just kept explaining how convenient the arrangement would be for everyone. At one point, she even said something that stuck with me. She said she was glad she could always rely on me. For a moment, I almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, but because she sounded so certain. So confident that everything would work exactly the way it always had. She finished the call by saying she would come by on Friday afternoon. That was the entire conversation. Rachel hung up, believing the plan was settled. But the truth was, by the time she made that call, the decision I had been quietly building for weeks was already finished. Rachel just did not know it yet. And when she showed up at my apartment on Friday, expecting the usual door to open for her, she was about to discover something that had never happened before. This time, things were not going to go the way she expected. Friday afternoon arrived quietly. I came home from work earlier than usual that day, not because I had plans, but because I wanted to be there before Rachel arrived. The apartment felt calm in a way it had not felt for a long time. Everything was where it belonged. The counters were clear. The couch cushions were straight. The hallway was empty, without toy cars scattered across the floor. I walked through each room slowly, almost like I was seeing the place again for the first time. For years, I had thought of this apartment as a reward for surviving the chaos of our childhood home. It was small, nothing fancy, but it represented something important to me. Control. Peace. A place where the noise of other people's lives did not spill into every corner. Standing in the living room that afternoon, I realized how much of that peace had slowly disappeared. Not all at once, just a little at a time. A few extra visits here, A few unexpected favors there. Until one day I was standing in my own doorway feeling like the visitor. That was not going to happen again. About an hour later, my phone buzzed. Rachel. Her message was short. On our way. No question. No confirmation. Just another update about a plan she believed was already settled. I looked at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down on the kitchen counter. Then I walked to the front door. The locksmith had come earlier that morning. It had taken him less than 20 minutes to change the lock. He had handed me the new key and wished me a good day, completely unaware that he had just changed something much bigger than a piece of metal in a door. Now the old key Rachel had used for years would not open anything. I sat down on the couch and waited. About 30 minutes later, I heard a car pull up outside. Then voices. Rachel's kids were laughing about something as they climbed out of the car. Their backpacks thumped against the sidewalk. A moment later, Rachel's footsteps came up the walkway. The familiar sound of the key sliding into the lock followed. Then a pause. A small metallic click. Another attempt. The key turned again, harder this time. But nothing happened. From inside the apartment, I could hear Rachel mutter something under her breath. Then came the sound of the key trying again. And again. Finally, the doorbell rang. For the first time in years, Rachel was standing outside my apartment without automatic access. And the look on her face when I opened the door was the moment everything finally started to change. When I opened the door, Rachel was standing there with the key still in her hand. For a moment, she just stared at me. Behind her, the kids were already halfway up the steps with their backpacks and a small duffel bag Rachel must have packed for them. Rachel looked confused more than anything else. She held up the key and tried it again in the lock while the door was open, like she thought maybe she had done something wrong. The key slid in, turned, and did nothing. Her eyebrows pulled together. She looked back at me and asked what happened to the lock. I told her calmly that I had it changed earlier that morning. For a second, she did not react. It was the kind of pause people have when their brain is still trying to fit new information into an old expectation. Then she asked why. I kept my voice steady and explained something simple. I told her that my apartment needed to feel like my apartment again. Rachel blinked a few times like she had not fully understood what I meant. The kids were starting to shift impatiently behind her, clearly expecting to go inside the way they always had before. Rachel glanced back at them and then back at me. She said something about the trip she had already told me about. 3 days. Maybe 4. She reminded me that she was counting on me. There was no anger in her voice yet. Just confusion. Like the situation did not make sense. I told her I remembered the call. Then I explained something she had not expected to hear. I said that she had told me the plan, but she never asked if it worked for me. Rachel opened her mouth like she was about to argue, but the words did not come out right away. For the first time in years, the usual rhythm of our conversations had been interrupted. She was used to explaining what she needed and watching me adjust around it. This time the adjustment had already happened, just not in the direction she expected. Her voice sharpened a little as she said the kids were already here, that it would only be a few days, that she had already arranged everything. I nodded. Then I told her something very simple. I said that my apartment was not available. Rachel stared at me like she was waiting for the rest of the sentence, like maybe I would soften it somehow. But there was nothing else to add. The kids looked between us, clearly sensing something had changed even if they did not understand what. Rachel shifted the duffel bag from one hand to the other. Her confidence had faded, replaced by something less certain. Because for the first time since she started relying on my apartment years ago, the situation she had counted on no longer existed. And she was only just beginning to realize it. For a long moment, Rachel did not say anything. She just stood there on the walkway, holding the bag, looking at me like the ground under her feet had suddenly shifted. Behind her, the kids had stopped talking. They were watching both of us now, sensing the tension even if they did not fully understand it. Rachel finally asked if I was serious. Not angry yet, just surprised. I told her I was. She let out a short breath and looked past me into the apartment, like maybe she expected to see something that would explain the situation. But the place looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet. Orderly. Mine. Rachel shook her head slightly and said something about how she had already explained everything earlier in the week. She reminded me that she had a lot going on and that the kids had nowhere else to stay. Then she added something that revealed exactly how certain she had been about all of this. She said she thought we already had an understanding. I nodded slowly. Then I explained something I had spent weeks thinking about. I told her that for a long time I had been helping because I wanted to help, because families should support each other when things get difficult. But somewhere along the way, that help had turned into something else. It had stopped being a favor. It had become an expectation. Rachel did not interrupt this time. She just listened, her expression slowly tightening. I told her that my apartment was the only place in my life where things felt calm and controlled. After years of chaos growing up, that quiet mattered more to me than I had probably ever explained out loud. And lately, that quiet had been disappearing. Not because anyone meant harm, just because boundaries had slowly faded away. Rachel shifted her weight and glanced at the kids again. One of them was sitting on the step now, kicking his shoes against the concrete. I could see the moment she understood what I was saying. This was not about the weekend. This was about everything that had happened before it. I told her something simple. I said I still cared about her and the kids. That was not going to change. But my apartment was not going to be the backup plan anymore. Rachel was quiet for a long time after that. Finally, she picked up the bag again and called the kids toward the car. There was no dramatic argument. No shouting across the walkway. Just a quiet shift in the air. Before she got into the car, she looked back at me one last time. Not angry, just thoughtful, like she was realizing that something in our relationship had finally changed. I closed the door after they left and locked it. The apartment was silent again. For the first time in a long while, the quiet did not feel temporary. It felt like control. And sometimes, the most powerful decision a person can make is not loud at all. Sometimes it is simply the moment you decide that no is finally enough.